Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. And in thinking about and looking at the project and what you've done, I thought perhaps the most useful thing I could do was, rather than talk about work that's already published about communicating about these kinds of topics, for which I recommend these two special issues of the Proceedings of our National Academy of Sciences, which have some really good papers by well-known people in other areas who we tried to get to apply themselves here, that I would talk about. Might be the best way to use your time would be to talk about how it is that one evaluates programs, both the kind of communication programs, but other kinds of programs that you have. This is something that's been on our minds from some of different activities, one of which is we've been working with an American philanthropy called Skoll Global Threats, which has set up this organization, the Climate Advocacy Lab, that's designed to bring social science to the service of people working on advocacy regarding climate change. So similar spirit to some of what you're trying to do here. As Gulbanu mentioned, I chaired our Food and Drug Administration's Risk Communication Advisory Committee, which also faces challenges of how to advise its programs. What for me coalesced my thinking is our older son Ilya has been until recently worked on our national climate assessment and had a workshop about 2 years ago on how to evaluate the national climate assessment, which is a massive effort at synthesizing, communicating scientific information. So one could think of evaluation as having two goals. One is accountability, is how well did the program perform, relative, say, to the resources or the trust that's been invested in it. And second is learning, how well could a program perform. You could have two types of evaluation. You could look at its outcomes, that is, what does a program produce, or you could look at its process, that is, what does a program do. This outcome and process evaluation can lead you into different directions. So, for example, if you're thinking about a political campaign, an outcome measure might be voter turnout. A process measure might be whether or not you've created a self-sustaining movement that will turn people out for successive elections. A place to think about this is there's this marvelous organization in the U.S. called the Analyst Institute, who's funded by progressive Democratic Party activists and unions before the 2008 presidential election. There's a terrific New York Times coverage that came out just before the 2012 election, used the latest of social science in order to turn out the vote. So it was focused on outcomes, not focused on process. One could wonder, gee, we got out the vote in 2008, got out the vote in 2012, and got what did I think the president say, got creamed and smeared. Anyways, lost big in 2010 and 2014 because there wasn't the sustained movement. You could think about the evaluation of health-related campaigns. An outcome measure might be how many people get vaccinated. A process measure would be how strong is your public health infrastructure. One thing that got me thinking about this is our other son, Noam, towards the end of last year said, I'm trying to decide what charities to contribute to, kind of a family habit. We think concentratedly at the end of the year. And he found two parallel organizations, one in the UK and one in the United States, that had come up with very similar lists of what they thought were best buys in charitable contributions, both of which had settled and which tended to be very practical, outcome-oriented organizations like bed nets, vaccinations, treatments for schistosomiasis. The UK organization has a wonderful website which has an interesting discussion of why they focused on outcome rather than process. They use somewhat different terms, so they say, why aren't we, in response to their internal and external critics say, well, why aren't we building up the health infrastructure, saying, well, we're doing vertical integration that might serve as a model for other things, and we're taking the burden of schistosomiasis or off of the healthcare systems of developing countries that are already overburdened. So I'm going to talk about process evaluation, but I think it's an interesting and important attention. And the third thing would be, third analysis would be some kind of analysis. You're trying to improve intelligence analysis or analysis of social system. An outcome measure would be how accurate is your analysis in predicting something in the future, and a process would be how well have we furthered our understanding of a complicated process that may have a variety of outcomes, not all of which are as tangible. So an example, an outcome measure focus would be James Surek's The Wisdom of Crowds, which is actually the accuracy of crowds. That is, how do we get better answers? Not necessarily, we don't know exactly why. It isn't the process that he talks about doesn't tell you how the system works, how it is that people got to better understanding. It just produces. There's subsequent research that's trying to tease that out, but it's really focused on outcomes rather than processes. So process evaluation, which I'm going to talk about, will be better when outcome evaluation creates perverse incentives. So a classic example would be you are rewarded for the number of students taught, clients served, or clients served, and not for the quality of the instruction or of the surface. Could be when outcome evaluation sacrifices long-term goals. So you're getting out the vote and you're not building a movement. You've got fixed resources, and maybe valuing one kind of activity rather than the other. Where it requires unrealistic resources. So my wife was sitting in the back, has worked in social services. There's a lot of pressure to evaluate programs for child abuse prevention. It costs a lot of money to do a decent outcome evaluation. And there is, at least in the US, an industry of people who do ineffective evaluations for the amount of money that granting agencies are willing to give you. So you're not served by doing something that provides poor signals and sucks up resources that could be used for something else, and creates the opportunity cost of imagining that you've addressed this problem, and outcome evaluation also doesn't serve you well when it provides little guidance on how to improve. So at the end of the process, you see how well you did, and it doesn't tell you, because these interventions, all of the interesting interventions are really complicated. You can't tell what exactly made the difference. Process evaluation is better when will work better in places where you want to give it a chance, where it's founded on scientific principles. That is, what we know about how people think, groups work, organizations function. It becomes part of people's everyday thinking. So if you're trying to evaluate the process, if people can reflect on what's going and extract reasonable signals as they go along, they may be able to self-correct rather than waiting for an outcome measure at the end. And it somehow strengthens group dynamics on which any of our programs depend, because you want to be able to recruit, retain, and reward the best people. So in thinking about this as not an evaluation specialist, but as a cognitive decision psychologist, so how do you come up with something that will meet those 10? So one, you don't want to give short lists of things to do because they're necessarily vague. Any simple principle about how one is to run an organization or inform their own behavior can't do justice to the complexity of it. On the other hand, you give people a long list of things to do with the constraint of 7 or plus or minus 2 things that people can bear in mind, which will be familiar to the psychologist. People aren't going to remember it. So third is that people often learn better from examples than from principles. And then finally, that people are often better at relative than absolute judgments. You can tell which of 2 ways are better rather than telling which way is actually good. And better is often all we can do is better. We can't necessarily do good. So here's a list at the lower end of, just below the lower end of 7 plus or minus 2, but hence maybe too short, so short as to be vague, 4 things that one might consider in process evaluation for programs. So staffing, internal consultation, external consultation, and decision-making processes. So expansion will be staffing, are the right people involved in your project? Internal consultation, are they talking effectively with one another? External consultation, are they talking effectively with other stakeholders? Decision making, are concerns properly integrated? So I'll go through each of these quickly. So are the right people involved? So the right people would in part be the people who have the substantive expertise, needed to address the problem. And in the decision sciences, our way of identifying relevant expertise is by looking at the decisions that people face. So, and this is something, you can do these in great detail, but something anybody could do on the back of an envelope. For those of you who still send mail. So you could create a decision tree. Probably if you're in a business school, you've probably all seen some variant of that. You've got a decision on the left, you have uncertainties, you have outcomes, and you could think about, this is a decision about whether to use the morning after pill, as it's called in the U.S., but any decision tree has this. So you would, if you're trying to inform a particular decision, you'd want to make certain that you had the expertise in all the forms of uncertainty and the expertise in all of the outcomes. If you've not, then you're missing something. A second kind of way of thinking about it is, what is it that people don't just want to know the best advice, but they want to know how a system works? You could create an influence diagram, or various variations on this formality, looking at the set of factors that determine the outcomes that interest you. As I put references on most of these slides. If you're you certainly come to see me, but you could find this. You'll have the slides here. Here's a piece that Nick box from a piece that Nick Pigeon and I had in the first issue of Nature Climate Change, talking about who are the people that you need to have for communication about climate change. So it's subject matter experts, as would be defined by those figures like those ones we just showed. You'd have decision scientists who can take the universe of things that it would be nice to know and identify the things that one needs to know. Social and communication scientists who can find out where people are and address their needs. And finally, program designers or practitioners who can make the whole thing run. And then you need some kind of an organization that will coordinate them. That is, you need that all opinions would be welcome, but authority for a communication program or other one rests with the people who know the most. So you'd want your subject matter experts to check have the last word on accuracy, decision scientists for relevance, and so on. You often, everybody's a stylist, so everybody wants to rewrite things into what looks right to them. If you want to make certain that it's accurate, you want the subject matter experts to test that. If you want to make certain it works for your audience, somebody's got to test it to see whether they understand the stylings. So the second thing is you want, if you got the right people, are they talking to each other? And one way to think about internal consultation that here's a way to think about it that came from an evaluation that was funded by the National Science Foundation to evaluate a multidisciplinary center on climate change that we've had running for about 20 years, and I ran for about 4 years. I played the Hybrid Vigor Institute to do evaluation of 6 of these centers. The sociologist who did it, Diana Roten, used a kind of formal, but not overly formal, network analysis where she asked everybody associated with the center to characterize the kinds of relationships that they had with everybody else in the center, and then showed the wiring. So this is one center where some people have very tight connections and other people have very loose connections, and if you look at their disciplines, the natural scientists have tight connections and the social scientists are out on the periphery. And that might or might not be what you want to do given the nature of your program, but if you think proscriptively about who you want to be talking, this is a way to think about it in a structured way. Here's another one of the centers that this is, I think, actually another evaluation of the same center. If you look at the next level, who actually has close and collegial relationships, it turns out that the only people who are actually talking across it are people whose job it is to cross talk. So they had a, I don't know, ethnographer, science studies person embedded in it, and they needed to talk to anybody, and they had a statistician who talked to everybody. So what was billed as an interdisciplinary program was actually a multidisciplinary program, and sometimes that's all you can do. And sometimes you're better off having multidisciplinary, because then people aren't fighting on how to solve problems together, but they're listening to one another respectfully. But that is a choice that one would need to make. One also can have issues of group process. This is sort of another body of research on which you could draw for seeing whether there's a scientific foundation for how you're running things. The first time I got to doing my work with FDA, the first time I got there, they had posters all over their new headquarters about the Equal Voice Initiative. So you can imagine if somebody's got an Equal Voice Initiative, some people felt that their voices are less equal. And this had authority from the commissioner, so it was like in their rule book, so somebody was taking it seriously. On the other hand, I came across this in an industry newsletter that equal voice policy does not mean equal weight in decision making. And by the law, that actually needs to be that way, but one needs to, but that's a tougher act to do, and it's important that you make it clear. I need to hear you, but I don't need to listen to you, or the other way around. So, third, external consultation. Are people talking to effectively with the other stakeholders? There are many diagrams like this. This is the one that I favor from various bodies. I think all of the English-speaking countries have something like this. This is from a Canadian Standards Association. So you have a project in the middle. You have a kind of standard project development process, and significant for this context, that in this view there's risk communication connected by two-way arrows at all stages of the process. So you don't start your communication or management or intervention until you've heard from the stakeholders, and so you have a better chance of being relevant, and you don't start until they have some idea of the direction that you're going, so they're not blindsided, and they feel consulted, you've been transparent that way, and it continues all along. FDA, in trying to, how you do this depends on how far you are from your stakeholders, how trusting they are, how much trust you could build if you did it well. FDA has a very interesting initiative called the Voice of the Patient. You can search for it, that every 3 months they go out and talk to patients and patient advocates, but particularly to patients on tough conditions. They want to make certain that they know what kind of trade-offs to make when approving products. There's Sarah Eggers, one of my former PhD students, is running it. They have a very moving one on sickle cell disease, and it's a determined effort to listen to external stakeholders. About 20 years ago, I was on an Institute of Medicine committee on environmental justice that laid out how this might be done for people studying environmental problems. So it says, prove the scientific base, involve the affected population, and communicate the findings to all stakeholders. Sort of open two-way communications with communities of concern regarding the conduct and results of their research activities. So in our consultation with the affected communities, this seemed to be critical to them. And we have a FDA committee produced a risk communication advisory, this guidebook. It has chapters. Each chapter gives you, in 3,000 words or less, gives you the problem, the state of the science, best guesses at best practices, and shows how you can evaluate your communications for no money, a little money, or resources commensurate with the stakes, because you don't really know if you've communicated until you've tested it. And we wanted to make testing the science available to everybody. And then finally, decision-making, are concerns properly integrated? So FDA has a strategic plan for risk communication. Its leadership had decided that the communication was not just an afterthought, but required forethought. My committee did things like recommending how they deal with emerging events. So you're beginning to hear problems from food safety problems from the field. You don't want to blow the whistle too early, because then needlessly alarm people. You don't want to be too late, because then people get hurt and you've been guilty of a cover-up. So we recommended some standard procedures for integrating these concerns. And then finally, FDA has developed in their approval decisions, has developed a structured approach to making their decisions intended to make them more transparent within the constraints of the law, and fighting off strong pressure from industry to have a kind of quantification that's inappropriate for these kinds of decisions. So you can it has, very briefly, it has on the left the different kinds of consideration. It separates scientific judgments from ethical judgments in the two columns in order to make the point that it necessarily makes both of them. So here are the major considerations. So this is an attempt to come up with a decision-making process that normal people can deal with, both the people who are producing the evidence and people who are summarizing it. And so if one goes this route with process evaluation, you want to have people with the requisite expertise coordinating with one another in ongoing dialogue with their stakeholders, and having appropriate people having the final say. So not incompatible with outcome evaluation, but sometimes better, and often a necessary at least a necessary complement. Okay, thank you.